just as an opening question and something that I anticipate that some people in the audience might be thinking, I think at least 2 of you, and I think possibly 3 of you, would fall into the category of saying that, you know, some of the findings that you have discussed involve the thesis that, you know, religion is evolutionarily adaptive, that it performs useful functions for societies. So then how would you explain the recent trends that are in the paper, particularly in places like New Zealand, about declining rates of religious affiliation? Azim, you suggested that rule of law might be displacing religion in certain ways. Can you each say a little bit more about that? Or maybe you disagree with that thesis. So maybe we'll just go in order here. I'll start with you, Quentin.
So, yeah, I think religion is this culturally evolved collection of things, some of which will be adaptive. So I was talking about how some sacrifice can potentially be adaptive for the group. But there's a big collection of things in there, so not all of those features that we call religion are necessarily adaptive. And also, as with any evolved thing, it may not be functional today, even if it was in the past. So I guess, yeah, I think the evolutionary approach is useful with those caveats that I've just outlined, yeah.
I would say, well, just partially reiterating what Quentin said, I think religion is not really one thing. So it's not only a collection of behaviors, but it's also, value systems, social, identities. So I've never thought you can, and this is really a problem with the literature in religion, that there are many different ways to define religion, and there are different sort of dimensions and components. They don't all necessarily have to change at the same time. So I never really took that much away from religious identity research that looks at the, whether people identify with a particular religion. I would prefer to focus on what people believe, sort of the underlying beliefs. And I'm not at all convinced that religious beliefs, defined more broadly, are on the wane at all.
Yeah, I'll agree with what these 2 guys said. I'll also say that globally, we don't actually see much of a decline in even the affiliation aspect. And the reason for that is because of demographic differences in fertility rates. And so one very adaptive, very culturally adaptive aspect of religions is that they're very pronatalist. They encourage you to have a lot of kids, and they discourage every aspect that would reduce the number of kids you have. Whereas what you tend to see in, I assume, places like New Zealand, but certainly places like Canada and the US and Western Europe and Japan, is vastly declining rates of fertility that are accompanying a lot of these secularization trends. Whereas the places where there are a lot of children being born tend to be the most religious places in the world. And so in total numbers and in proportions, you're actually seeing, they're projecting a declining proportion of non-religious people. Now, those projections are difficult because they take in and don't take into account a lot of other factors, but I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in terms of just the religious affiliation stuff over the next 50 years.
Can I ask a question? Could I follow up on that? Is that relationship between fertility and religious identity, is that a causal one, or a functional one? Is that what you're?
Yeah. I mean, I could. It's easy to weave a causal story for that, right? In the U.S., so even within the U.S., you have vast differences between fertility rates among different groups. I think it's something that the average atheist couple will have something like 1.2 children. The average Muslim will have 3. The average Amish will have something like 7. It's a pretty stark difference. There's obviously other factors, right? So you're going to tend to find atheist people in urban areas. Urban areas, you have smaller houses, so people have fewer children because they don't have room for them. So there are other factors involved. But I mean, I think that the norms that accompany a lot of religions, which encourage you to have a lot of children, probably play a causal role.
But also maybe like social support might facilitate, social support that comes with being in a religious community might facilitate or encourage you to have more children.
It's true, and so that's one thing that secular governments have been trying to do, which is offer up some sort of replacement for the lacking social support in a way to encourage their citizens to have more children. It doesn't seem to be working very well.
Jamin, I'll just ask a question to you, which is that it struck me with the research that you presented that there are these conditions under which, their people's implicit beliefs or their behaviors will indicate one thing and their explicit beliefs will indicate others, but that their explicit beliefs, at least, will shift among different contexts. And this was very striking, and when Jesse's talking about his Princess Alice experiments this morning, that the kids would say, no, we don't believe in it, and then when put on their own, they would demonstrate behaviors that indicated that they did. Can you say something about why people disavow these beliefs, or the contexts or cultural conditions that have made that important to do? Is it a signaling?
Sorry, the context in which they deny that
they deny the belief, yeah. Why would you say people are disavowing these beliefs?
Well, first of all, not that many people are disavowing them.
Right.
So still the majority of people, as I showed at the beginning, are avowing them. But I don't know, I think that, I don't know the answer for sure to that. I think that people's explicit belief vary with context, with social, might be living in a society that's less receptive to explicit religious affiliations or beliefs, and or might encourage, people to express beliefs in certain ways in different contexts. I think it's especially, this is a problem with doing stuff in the lab, because, we find that, well, at least a possibility is that people are reluctant to disclose beliefs, supernatural beliefs of any kind when they think they're being measured by a, psychologist, or assume that the psychologist doesn't believe in supernatural things himself. So in fact, we did a study, actually, I didn't present this, but we did a study where people's afterlife beliefs shifted as a function of whether sort of a proxy for the scientist was a picture of us was up on the wall or not. So we had one condition where it just said, there was a sign that said, please be quiet. And there's another version where it said, please be quiet, but it had a guy like with just a face with a shh sound on it. So in the shh version with the face, people were more likely to think, or more likely to say, that science was a good explanation for supernatural events than otherwise. So I guess, sorry, the short answer is that too late for the short answer, actually. What the short answer should have been, that I think it depends on the context, really. I don't know if there's sort of a more profound explanation.
Good. I might just open the floor for questions here.
Hi, I just was interested in your any comments you had around linguistics, because I was thinking particularly in the second presentation about explicit and implicit beliefs, but things like, asking, do you believe in the afterlife, versus asking, do you believe there may be an afterlife? And I just think there's quite a lot in what you've talked about that, and what you talked about just before about people being reluctant to express beliefs could come down to linguistics, and same with do you describe yourself as an atheist if you don't have a religious affiliation, but you believe in something less, less concrete than that? Just thought that there could be a sort of a layering of that on top of everything else that's going on as well.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand your question. Are you asking, is there sort of a bit of semantic kind of trickery going on or ambiguity in this?
No, I just think that that it would be an important component of the linguistics of how the question is asked, but also of how people personally express themselves. So what they may be more comfortable in saying or not saying. So just like the difference, like say between, do you believe in the afterlife, or may there be could there be an afterlife, and just how much that sort of affects people's responsiveness to things.
Yeah, so you're sort of saying that I think you're making kind of the same point that I was making, that basically that you can't trust entirely, or you can't know entirely what people mean when they answer questions. like this, because there are sort of some social constraints, there's some ambiguity in the wording. I mean, this is I was probably a little too loose with the data on the believing in the afterlife versus believing in heaven, because I mean, to be fair, I don't think that's quite as inconsistent as it seems, because people may, we don't totally know what people have in mind in either one of those cases. But I guess that's kind of my part of my point, I guess, that there isn't necessarily a single thing that everybody has in mind when they answer questions about their beliefs, especially in the afterlife.
We did give them an option, that's a set of categories in terms of belief type, so it wasn't just simply do you believe or not.
Oh yeah, yeah. Sorry, in the second one with the pie chart, it was more than just a believe or not believe. There was sort of an option of 7 versions of the afterlife. So the people who denied, that the finding is that the people who gave the most extreme version, that's expressed the most confidence, that logically ruled out all the other versions, nevertheless also endorsed the other versions. That's all.
So I have a question for Jamin. I'm very disappointed in my fellow non-believers in ghosts, that they behaved so ridiculously, superstitiously in your experiment. So I was trying to find a way of explaining their behavior, and I think I may have done for the second experiment. When you're measuring the galvanic skin response, could you argue that people who believed in ghosts were less surprised when something ghostly happened in the room, and therefore showed less physical response, whereas people who didn't expect anything to happen would have shown a stronger response to something because they didn't expect it? I can't help with this first one, or the earlier experiment.
So, sorry, are you asking whether people, are you talking about the
I guess what I'm really asking is, could we find other explanations? You didn't really offer an explanation of why you think people who don't believe in ghosts nevertheless reveal not just an equal belief, but a higher likelihood of, if you take a response, a startled response to be evidence of an implicit belief. So I'm questioning whether that's true, I guess.
Well, first of all, to be fair, that's not, so there's no interaction between the presence of the ghost and people's explicit beliefs. So what I was just illustrating that, if anything, so that's not a significant effect, in other words. It's a trend, and I was just pointing out that you might think that at least the people who believe most confidently, at least they're not going to be afraid of ghosts, and ironically, if anything, they are more afraid of ghosts. But let's assume that with some more power in the study, that would turn out to be true. So that's a really, I'm not sure what the answer to that is. There's sort of a Freudian interpretation that I won't even go into. that those people are really, well, I won't go into it. But also, there's sort of an analog with the study where you dared, they dared God to do terrible things to themselves and their families. In that study as well, she reported that the people who were most likely to, people who didn't believe people who believed in God were less upset about that than people who didn't believe in God. And the argument is that those people had a more sort of confident or solid or coherent understanding of God. They basically said, well, God knows that I don't mean those things. If an experimenter tells me to say that, I don't really mean I want them. So in a way, it's like the non-religious people had almost a less sophisticated or less developed understanding of God's intentions and relationship to them. So I have wondered whether that could be, something like that could be explaining the results in our study as well. Like sort of a differential understanding of what ghosts are capable of, or or sort of less familiarity with the construct.
First of all, thank you, and I apologize in advance if this question is a little bit too far-fetched. I was just curious, looking at the historical and contemporary war on religion, even though it's not ritualistic in nature, it is inherently a mass human sacrifice. I was just wondering if there is any correlation between the societal stratification and the cultures that are involved in these wars.
I didn't, whether there's an association between...
What you mentioned about the stratification of the society and whether there's any correlation between the cultures that have been very prominent in wars and, yeah, like the stratification.
Like, so is social stratification associated with religiously motivated warfare?
Yes.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't have data on that. Yeah, so I'm not going to speculate.
Thank you. My question is to everyone on this panel. I really enjoyed this set of talks, and I was thinking to myself of starting a religious cult to try to increase cooperation after I leave today. And you know, I'm trying to figure out how to do it, and I'd like advice from everyone because I'm sensing some conflict between the talks. So I'm going to have punishment as part of it, and I know that's effective, but then I thought, well, it doesn't need to be effective. You just need ritual, really. It doesn't matter about what people believe after the afterlife. They just have to, you know, sacrifice and have some sort of motivated ritual, and that will be enough to preserve cooperation. But then I was thinking, okay, well, let's say that I do include belief in supernatural punishment of some kind. Do I actually need people to believe what I'm telling them? And then I was thinking, well, I do, because when you look across countries, it seems like where people endorsing this belief the most is where they're the most cooperative. But then I was thinking, oh, well, I don't, because it doesn't matter what people say they believe, they're going to do it anyway because they're afraid of Princess Alice or lights switching off or whatever. And so now I'm hopelessly confused, and I'm just hoping you guys can help me out with my new cult.
Should we start with Azim on this? Do you want to start?
Well, Josh, I think your real challenge is that it's a pretty saturated market. So I think what you really have to figure out is how you're going to recruit people and what niche is available. And I think Jamin's research here is going to be very helpful because presumably it seems like you have this large contingent of people who are saying they're not believers, who are not affiliating, growing numbers of people who are not affiliating, who probably actually believe a whole bunch of stuff that you could scoop them up.
It's great advice. Anything else?
Jamin and then Quentin.
No, I mean, for me, if I understand your question, I don't think, it doesn't seem to me that belief is actually and if I understand Quentin's arguments as well, it doesn't seem to me that belief is necessary, just sort of helpful. You know, like you could imagine a system of sacrifice that does reinforce the existing power structure that doesn't require supernatural input into it. That's just sort of a helpful ingredient. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, I wasn't trying to suggest that the belief aspect isn't important. I just thought I'd talk about the practice side of religion as something else interesting to think about. But I do, in fact, so also that Richard Sosa's study on the communes that found this effect of these costly requirements on how long the groups lasted, but it was only in the religious groups. And I do think we don't fully understand why that's the case. Like, so there were these non-religious groups that they're built around ideologies that are just not what we call religion. And for some reason, when they ask people to do all these things, the people are like, no, or or at least it doesn't make them stick around longer. So what is it about the kind of combination of the practice and the costly requirements and the religious side of things that works? I don't have a great answer for that, but I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, the way I've always seen these religions is, we talked about how they have multiple components, but I think that they become more than the sum of their individual components, more than the sum of their parts, because those different parts get their power from each other, right? So if you have an afterlife, so there's a lot of reasons why we'd have an afterlife. We talked about some cognitive reasons, there's motivational reasons, and then you add this moral component to it. That moral component is reinforced by the fact that you'll have, say, an omniscient agent who knows when you're not following the rules. Those things are reinforced by the fact that to go against those rules means that you're sacrificing a large part of your identity, which is now involved in the religion. That's reinforced by the consistent, as Harvey Whitehouse would say, the low-level rituals that you're constantly participating in. All these bits individually would not be as strong as they are when you fuse them together. And I think that's why religions have been such effective things, is because they, basically, I think when you have enough of these components together, they take on this supernatural thing, and we call them religions. But they all those little bits, they benefit from being connected to each other. So think big.
So I might just follow up with this question, just to ask to the group here then. Does that mean that religions evolve differently than other kinds of cultural constructs, say language, because they evolve in these multi-component ways that feed off each other? And would you agree with that religion has a different style of cultural evolution than other?
Well, I think at some level, I mean, culture is so amazingly complex and diverse that everything's a little bit different. But I think there is at a more general level that it's pretty much all the same. Like, so we could think about the evolution of religious institutions, political institutions. They're evolving. The basic constraints are the same, and there's some subset of cultural institutions we draw a line around and call them religions, but they share features with others. And yeah, I guess examples like the organizational structure of a religion might look a lot like a secular organizational structure of a political organization. The rituals might look a lot like what you do around your sports teams. So I don't think it's particularly special in that regard. Yeah.
Can I ask Chris Paul, because I had a question sort of similar to that about the study distinguishing the religious from the secular communes. So how, I mean, for this very reason, I find it hard to distinguish. I would find it hard to distinguish what really makes for a religious commune, because I mean, from my perspective, everybody is religious. It's just I mean, people say, well, I don't believe in God. I just believe in that there's something up there, or I don't believe in fate. I just believe that there things happen for a reason. Like they have sort of secular. A lot of people have very secular versions of basically the same belief structure or components that are like core religious principles. So I wondered. I mean, what is it that's distinguishing the religious ones from the? Is it just the label, or is it the organizational structure, or what makes something a religious cult besides the name?
Well, I think, I mean, it's been a while since I read Richard Sosis's paper, so I can't remember what definition he uses, but the presence of the supernatural and the supernatural agents and this idea of the sacred, which, yeah, I mean, I think there's a kind of spectrum there. Like some of these cults, communes were communist, and they might have almost deified someone like Marx, but yeah, so there is a gray area. But when you try and draw a line, they seem to show quite different patterns.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to that is I think there's a lot of value in actually codifying those particular beliefs, because it means you can trust that other people believe them too. So if you have two people who independently have the same afterlife beliefs, but they haven't told each other that, then you can't trust that the other person's going to follow the same rules, even though they might. So when you have everybody openly sharing a set of beliefs, then other people become more predictable, and you have more of a cohesive group.
We have time for one more question.
Hi. So I was wondering about the research that you talked about, Jamin, where non-believers experienced a high level of arousal when asked to dare God to make their life miserable. And just to lead into my question, when I was little, I didn't believe in Santa. I knew he wasn't real. And my friend said, well, if you think he's not real, then yell out that he's not real and he won't bring you any presents. So I did. And I remember feeling really scared because there's that tiny, tiny chance that I'm wrong, and then I wouldn't get any presents. So I wonder, with belief in the afterlife, even if you really strongly believe there isn't one, that penalty for being wrong is probably a lot greater than the penalty for believing and being wrong. Do you think that could have something to do with it?
Well, it may, but I mean, I've always thought that's kind of a logical fallacy. Like this is the
Pascal's wager.
That's right. Pascal. This is like the Pascal's wager idea that you can you know, you might as well. I mean, there's no harm in believing, but because you know, if you're wrong, then there's no harm done. But if you're right, then there's huge rewards. And if you don't believe, if you choose not to believe, then you know, you're risking like eternal damnation, right? So the costs and benefits make it useful to believe. Well, first of all, I mean, I wish I could just will myself to believe in the afterlife, but I just sort of can't. I can't sort of do it. I'm not sure I believe that people can that like they believe through sheer power of willpower. They can just decide I'm going to believe in Santa or I'm going to believe now in God because I think would really be handy. And the other thing I've never understood the Pascal's wager thing, to be honest, because it always sort of just begs the question in the logical sense. It's assuming the premise that it's supposed to be testing. In other words, right? So because you don't know, that Pascal's wager only works if the God you're thinking about is a benevolent and non-jealous God, right? So if it turns out that, and you don't know that's true. So if it turns out that the real God actually, you know, really gets angry if you believe in someone in a different God, right? Then and will punish you. Then it could be a huge, just as bad of a penalty for believing in that God, you know, in the Christian God, say, as not believing in God. So just if you don't know what the true state of God or Santa or the afterlife is, then you can't really make that wager, I guess.
Okay, on that happy note, I think we may call a session closed today, and please thank our speakers for great presentations.